The receipt is still warm in your hand when you step out of the grocery store. You pause just outside the sliding doors, shifting the bags, because one handle is already digging into your fingers. You glance down at the total again. It's higher than you expected. It's always higher than you expected. So you do that thing you always do. Quick mental math, subtracting what's left in your account, adding what's coming in next week, wondering if that number will stretch far enough to cover everything between now and then. And for a second, just a second, you ask yourself something you've been avoiding for years. How does this ever end? Because it doesn't feel like one big problem. It feels like 1,000 tiny ones that never stop showing up. Your car could break down. Your laptop might die. You could lose your job. And none of those feel hypothetical, because you've already lived through at least one of them. Think about the last time your bank balance dipped lower than you were comfortable with. You didn't panic all at once. It was slower than that. You skipped eating out one weekend. You delayed buying something you actually needed. You told a friend, yeah, maybe next week, knowing full well you were just buying time. And then there's the quiet stuff. Standing in line, pretending not to care how much the total is. Leaving things behind at checkout because you miscalculated. Saying no to something small, not because it's expensive, but because it adds to the pile. Sound familiar? You probably know someone who's been working for 15, 20, even 30 years and still talks about money like it's something they haven't figured out yet. Not because they're careless, not because they're lazy, but because the system they're inside doesn't actually let them get ahead, and that's the part nobody says out loud. The reason this cycle feels impossible to escape is because, for most people, it's not a temporary phase. It's the default setting, so naturally the advice you hear sounds simple. Save more, spend less, invest early, let compound interest do its thing. You've heard it 100 times. And yeah, on paper it makes sense, but here's the problem. That advice assumes something that isn't true for most people. It assumes you have enough margin to begin with. Enough leftover at the end of the month to actually follow the plan. But here's where it gets really interesting. The real reason most people will never retire isn't that they don't know what to do. It's that the system quietly adjusts every time they try to get ahead. And unless you see that happening, you'll keep playing a game that resets every time you make progress. Because the first thing you need to understand is this. Your expenses don't stay still when your income grows. According to data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, consumer spending increases by an average of 91.3% of every additional dollar earned. Which means when you get a raise, almost all of it disappears into a slightly better version of your current life. Think about it. You make a little more, so you move to a slightly nicer place. You upgrade your phone. You eat out a bit more often. Nothing crazy, nothing irresponsible. Just better, and suddenly your new income doesn't feel like more, it feels normal. Here's what actually happens. You're pushing a boulder uphill, and every time you push harder, the hill quietly gets steeper. That's not a metaphor people use often, but it should be, because it explains why progress feels so temporary. You're not just trying to earn more. You're trying to outrun your own expectations, your environment, and the version of life that expands to meet your income. And this is where things get really practical. The second force working against you is something psychologists call hedonic adaptation. That's just a fancy way of saying you get used to things faster than you think. That new couch you were excited about? Normal in a month. The higher salary feels standard in 6 weeks. The upgraded lifestyle becomes your baseline before you even realize it. So you keep chasing the next upgrade, not because you're greedy, but because your brain resets the finish line every time you get closer. Now here's the part that will blow your mind. According to Federal Reserve data, 62.4% of Americans nearing retirement age have less than $142,300 saved. Read that again. That's after decades of working, decades of earning, decades of trying. And you might think, okay, maybe they just didn't invest properly. Maybe they started too late. But here's something most people completely miss. Even people who do everything right can still end up stuck. Take Ronald Reed. He was a janitor and gas station attendant from Vermont. Wore flannel shirts, drove a used Toyota, lived in the same modest house for decades. When he died in 2014, he left behind $731,200. Now compare that to Richard Fuscone, a former Merrill Lynch executive, Ivy League education. High income, lived in a 18,000 square foot mansion in Connecticut, filed for bankruptcy in 2008. Same country, same era. Completely opposite outcomes. So what's the difference? It's not intelligence, it's not income, it's behavior over time, especially when no one is watching. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because the system doesn't punish you for one big mistake. It drains you slowly through a series of small, reasonable decisions. You finance a car because everyone does. You take on a slightly higher rent because the place feels worth it. You carry a balance for a few months because something unexpected came up. Each decision makes sense on its own, but together they create something heavy. The mortgage sets your floor. The neighborhood sets your pressure. The square footage sets your obligations, and now your life requires a certain level of income just to stay in place. But here's the part nobody talks about. The more your life costs, the less freedom you have to change it. According to Vanguard's research, investors who consistently increased their savings rate by just 1.7% annually accumulated nearly twice as much wealth over 30 years compared to those who didn't. That's not because they earned dramatically more, it's because they created space before their lifestyle expanded to fill it. Think about someone you know who always seems financially calm, not flashy, not stressed, just steady. There's a good chance they built that calm early, before their expenses locked them into a certain pace. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the biggest trap isn't low income, it's high fixed costs. A study by the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute found that households with high fixed expenses, rent, loans, subscriptions, were 47.6% more likely to experience financial distress after even a small income disruption. You lose a little income and suddenly everything is at risk. Not because you were reckless, but because your margin was already thin, so retirement doesn't fail all at once. It fails quietly, over years, as your ability to save gets squeezed between obligations you can't easily reduce. Now let's talk about something that will probably surprise you. Time isn't actually your biggest advantage. Control is. You've heard that starting early is everything. And yeah, it helps. But starting early without control over your expenses is like pouring water into a bucket with a slow leak. You're making progress, but it's not accumulating the way you think. This is what behavioral economists call lifestyle creep inertia, the tendency for your spending habits to stick even when your priorities change. You might want to save more. You might plan to. But your existing commitments keep pulling you back to the same baseline. So even when your mindset shifts, your structure doesn't. And that's why people who intend to get serious later often never do. Because later comes with more responsibilities, not fewer. But here's something most people completely miss. Retirement isn't just a math problem, it's a timing problem. If most of your serious saving starts in your 40s or 50s, you're not just saving money, you're trying to compress decades of discipline into a much shorter window. According to Fidelity, individuals who start saving at age 25 need to set aside about 14.8% of their income to retire comfortably. If they start at 45, that number jumps to 33.6%. Same goal. Completely different pressure. And you feel that pressure. It's why saving later feels so intense, so restrictive, so unsustainable, because it is. Now here's the part that will blow your mind. The majority of people who say they plan to retire at 65 don't actually retire by choice. A report from the Employee Benefit Research Institute found that 52.7% of retirees left the workforce earlier than planned due to health issues, layoffs, or caregiving responsibilities. So the timeline you're imagining? It's not guaranteed. And that's where this gets personal, because for a long time I thought the solution was just discipline. Earn more, save more, invest better. Simple. It took me a while to accept this, but that's not enough. Because discipline without structure gets overwhelmed every time. You can be motivated, you can be informed, you can be trying your best, and still lose ground, because the system you've built around your life is working against you. So the real question isn't, are you saving enough? It's, have you built a life that allows saving to happen consistently without friction? And those are very different questions. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what if I'm already behind? Maybe you've got debt. Maybe your income barely covers your expenses. Maybe saving feels like a luxury you don't have. That's real. And it's exactly why the starting point can't be something massive. It's not about maxing out retirement accounts tomorrow. It's not about cutting everything you enjoy. It's about creating the smallest possible gap between what you earn and what you spend, and protecting that gap like it matters, because it does. Even $23 a week, even one expense reduced, even one decision delayed. Because that gap is where your future comes from. And once it exists, you can grow it, slowly, quietly, without needing your entire life to change overnight. Because here's the deepest part of all this: most people think retirement is about escaping work. It's not. It's about buying back control over your time before something else takes it from you. That's the part that doesn't show up in spreadsheets, the part no calculator can model. You're not just saving for a number, you're building the ability to say no, to walk away, to choose differently when life forces a decision you didn't plan for. And the reason most people never get there isn't because they failed. It's because no one showed them that the game they were playing was designed to keep resetting. So they kept pushing the boulder, harder, faster, longer, not realizing the hill was moving. But you see it now, and that changes things, because you're not the person who assumes time will fix it. You're not the person who waits for the perfect moment. You're the one who understands that small control, repeated consistently, becomes something most people never reach. You're the one who stops playing a game that was never built for you to win and quietly builds your own.